He was the son of a Korean missionary who grew up in Texas. He learned to fly in the Navy, but before Pearl Harbor, resigned his commission to join the American Volunteer Group in China. As one of the legendary Flying Tigers, he shot down 12 enemy aircraft. After Pearl Harbor, the Tigers were folded into the Army Air Force. He went right along and recorded 6 more kills. He commanded the 1st American Jet Fighter Squadron, and after the war, resigned his commission in the Air Force to become, at 34, the youngest general in the history of the Air National Guard. He is David Lee Tex Hill, and he is a legend of air power. David Lee Hill was born July 13, 1915, in Gwangju, Korea. He was the son of a Christian missionary. When he was still a baby, his father took sick and returned to the United States to recuperate. The family lived on a farm in Virginia for 4 years, then moved to Texas.
He was called to San Antonio as the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in 1921. So we came to Texas at that time. And my dad was a big hunter and fisherman, and so from the time I was a little kid, he'd take me hunting and fishing.
San Antonio was, of course, one of the most active military flight centers in the world. Hundreds of Army Air Corps pilots passed through town during their training at Randolph and Kelly Fields. The pilots in training were a familiar sight around town, and were a particularly familiar sight around the Hill home.
I had a good-looking sister and a first cousin that lived with us, and these cadets, Randolph used to come around, and Kelly, they used to come around in helmet and goggles, and everything. I thought that was pretty neat.
For a kid who spent his spare time making models of the airplanes he saw flying over his house every day, meeting all those pilot cadets was almost magical. Flight became an obsession with him.
So one day, a friend of mine and I, we slipped off from church and took our collection money and went out to Winburn Field, and a guy named Dick Hare took us around a pattern in an old travel there. And I was pretty much hooked from that time on.
In the 1930s, military aviation in the United States staggered along with almost no money or governmental support. Late in the decade, as the Japanese spread their empire across Asia and the Germans remilitarized and began to expand their holdings, President Franklin Roosevelt began quietly to expand American air power. New planes went into development, both bombers and fighters, what were then called pursuit craft. At the same time, the government ramped up the training of pilots. Many trained under the auspices of civilian agencies, but many others trained on Army Air Force bases, like those around San Antonio. Hill watched the influx of young pilots and vowed that he too would learn how to fly. His family sent him to military school in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The tall, gangly Texan fit in well at military school. He was well-liked and emerged as a leader among the cadets. He was not one for inspirational speeches. Instead, he led by example, and others followed. It helped that he made friends easily, a skill he learned from his father.
He always practiced being a friend to people. He said, if you want to have friends, you got to be one.
At military school, he learned the value of military discipline. He also earned a nickname. Soon after he arrived in Chattanooga, people stopped calling him David and started calling him Tex. The name followed him for the rest of his life.
He went to college at Texas A&M and then finished up at Austin. And upon graduation, he basically handed his diploma to his mom and went to enlist in the Army Air Corps. As it turns out, he was too tall. They wouldn't accept him. So he went across the street to the Navy and scrunched down, and by golly, they accepted him, and he became a naval aviator.
He moved through naval aviation training easily, a natural pilot who mastered not only aviation, but the tactics of aerial combat. He graduated from NAS Pensacola in 1939. He was assigned to a torpedo squadron aboard the USS Saratoga, and after that to a dive bomber squadron aboard the USS Ranger. He went to the Caribbean, where the Ranger sailed slowly in great sweeping circles while its pilots took off in support of mock amphibious landings on the beaches far below. Hill was flying, which was good, but even to a kid who'd grown up wanting only to be an aviator, the takeoff circle-land cycle grew boring. All over the world, great things were happening. The Japanese were advancing in Asia. The Germans and Italians were on the move in Europe and North Africa. The Ranger returned to Norfolk, and Hill and the other pilots reported to the operations officer ashore.
And he introduced us to this Commander Irvine, and he was the recruiter for CAMCO, Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. And so he said, pulled on this map, said this is Burma, and we didn't even know where Burma was, you know.
Commander Irvine explained that the Japanese had occupied Manchuria in 1931 and invaded China proper in 1937. The Imperial Army had backed the ragtag Chinese army into a corner. Their only resupply routes were overland from India through Burma. The Japanese had started harassing traffic along the Burma Road from the air, and the Chinese Air Force was hiring, paying 3 times as much as the Navy paid, plus a bounty on every Japanese plane shot down. The program, Irvine said, was not recognized by the United States government. It would require participants to resign their commissions in the Navy or Army and follow a circuitous route to their assigned bases. When they got there, they would fly P-40 Warhawks, an aircraft with which Hill was not familiar. Still, he decided to sign up. Commander Irvine shook his hand and disappeared, saying he'd be back in the future with a contract. Until then, he would stay in the Navy and do his duty. Soon after meeting with Commander Irvine, Hill and the Rangers shipped out to patrol the shipping lanes between North America and Great Britain. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun, and while the United States remained officially neutral, President Roosevelt had agreed to patrol the sea lanes southwest of Iceland and to report any U-boat activity to the British. It wasn't much, but until Commander Irvine reappeared, there seemed nothing better for Tex Hill to do. When Tex Hill set sail on his second tour of duty, all across the United States, young military pilots were meeting with the Chinese Air Force recruiter Hill had met. The story was the same. Not an official function. You'll have to resign your commission. We'll pay you more than you're making now. What the recruiter didn't say was that while the group of volunteers he was assembling was not officially recognized by the United States, it had the unofficial approval of President Roosevelt. The political climate in the United States was virulently anti-war. World War I, the first real appearance of American military might on the world stage, had left the country deeply scarred. The public at large believed that European and Asian wars had nothing to do with the United States. Roosevelt knew better and tried as best he could to support the nations fighting the Germans and Japanese without either violating American neutrality or getting the electorate up in arms. All over the world, he and his administration ran inconspicuous programs designed to steel the resistance to fascism. He used Lend-Lease, a program of financial aid to combatants, to give the Chinese the money they needed to buy American combat aircraft. He tacitly ordered the Army and Navy to open their ranks to Chinese pilot recruiters, but that was as far as the president could go.
So it was one thing for the United States government to want this operation to succeed, but given the circumstances, the political circumstances of the day, it was another for them to properly supply them. So they were at a disadvantage really from the get-go with outdated and outmoded equipment, and in some cases no equipment, to fight this battle.
Roosevelt assigned aircraft carriers to patrol the bulk of the North Atlantic under the guise that the trade routes between North America and Europe were American waters. In an era when everyone accepted 3 miles as the limit of a nation's claim on ocean waters, Roosevelt's doctrine was a stretch that freed up British aircraft and pilots for more pressing duties closer to home.
So when the convoys would make up, we would pull out ahead of them. We didn't know anything, you know. All we were was just another set of eyeballs. And so anything we saw, we'd call it out in the clear. And then the British would pick that up.
Hill and the other pilots stared down at 1 million square miles of open ocean in search of patrolling U-boats. They saw almost nothing and spent their days just flying back and forth across the water.
On one of my watches, we saw 2 submarines and a tender. And we reported it, and then on our next round, we would fly these, what they call a retiring search curve. And on our second round, there was nothing but oil slick debris. The tender was gone.
It was as close to war as any of the flyers had been. As exhilarating as it was, the mission quickly returned to boredom. In March 1941, the Ranger returned to port, and the Chinese recruiter, Commander Irvine, was there waiting for it, contracts in hand. Hill signed the contract and then resigned his commission. When 3 other flyers did the same, the base commander got on a plane and flew to Washington to complain. Admiral Harold Stark, the chief of naval operations, explained that though the Chinese project was not official, it was presidentially approved. The commander returned to Norfolk an angry man.
They gave us complete discharge. Navy, I mean, they didn't want to have anything to do with us. So we were in a civilian status, of course, and we had no, our government had no jurisdiction over us.
Hill said goodbye to his family and joined the flow of pilots heading for China. They traveled in small groups so as not to attract attention and assembled for training in Toungoo, Burma. By August 1941, Hill was back in military training, this time under the command of Colonel Claire Chennault. An American-trained pilot who befriended Chinese strongmen Chiang Kai-shek, Chennault was the operational brains of the American volunteer group. He'd conceived the project, flown with Chiang to the United States to buy the airplanes, and had set up the training base. But most importantly, Chennault created the doctrine under which the AVG would fight. Experienced with P-40s, Chennault understood the plane's limitations and taught his new Air Force how to fight around them.
In his tactical lectures, you could tell that the guy had been there and done that, you know. He just, he was the kind of guy that just exuded confidence. You could have confidence. You really knew that he knew where he was going.
Chennault organized the AVG into 3 squadrons. Hill was assigned to the 2nd, nicknamed the Panda Bears. Racing against time as the Japanese continued to advance, Hill worked fiercely to help meld his unit into a coherent whole. The pilots had flown all different aircraft on all kinds of missions, and getting them combat ready proved daunting.
The interesting thing about our operation was the fact that here General Chennault was able to take guys from different services and in a very short period of time weld them into the finest fighting outfit in the world at that time.
On December 7th, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The British, desperate for help in Rangoon, requested a squadron of American volunteers to help defend the city. The 3rd Squadron went south to Rangoon, while the 1st and 2nd went north to Kunming in China. Kunming had recently been a target of Japanese bombers.
So when we landed in there that evening, there were dead bodies everywhere. There's been a couple of hundred of them, people, arms and legs blown off, and that's when I really knew what war was all about.
On December 20th, not even 2 weeks after the United States entered the war, the American volunteer group attacked a group of Japanese bombers heading toward Kunming. The Americans shot down 4 Japanese bombers. It was the first American attack of World War II, and it was waged by a group of unofficial warriors that only months before the government had refused to even acknowledge. The American volunteer group, christened in the American press as the Flying Tigers, altered the balance of power in China. The Japanese, seldom challenged by the Chinese Air Force, were stunned to be confronted by aggressive American pilots. Few were more aggressive than Tex Hill. He got 2 kills on January 3rd, 1942, 2 weeks after going into combat for the first time. He knocked down 2 Japanese Ki-27 Nates over the Japanese airfield at Tak, Thailand. 3 weeks later, he scored 2 more. He made ace the next day, knocking down his 5th Japanese aircraft in just over a month of combat operations. By then, the Tigers had confirmed kills of 73 Japanese aircraft and had lost only 5 of their own. The Tigers seemed to confuse the Japanese. The tactics developed by Chennault, hitting and running in the fast P-40s instead of dogfighting, gave the Japanese little chance to use their superior fighters. And the small size of the American units made the support teams on the ground nearly as mobile as the planes in the air.
They would have to go into remote, advanced airstrips and set up an operation, and of course the Japanese would know about it the day they would arrive, and the next morning they would be attacked.
In March, Chennault promoted Hill to command of the 2nd Squadron. It seemed natural no one else in the squadron was as respected by the men as Hill. A fighting force made up of hard-drinking mercenaries, many of whom had been disciplinary problems in the regular military, needed special handling. Tex Hill's leadership philosophy could be summed up in 2 words: follow me. He cared little for the norms of military decorum on the ground. His squadron was, after all, made up of highly paid volunteers, not active-duty military personnel. And Hill himself saw no need to overdo the discipline.
Everybody looked up to him, and he never lost his sense of humor. He's just as funny today as he was then.
Despite the success of the AVG, the Japanese continued to advance in China. In May, they started building a bridge across the Salween River. The Japanese plan was to pour men and equipment over the bridge, build up their army, and defeat the Chinese once and for all. Hill led a flight of 4 P-40s down into the mile-deep Salween Gorge to demonstrate that the bridge could be hit. For the next 4 days, Hill and the AVG flew continuous missions down into the gorge. The Japanese gave up on the bridge, and their long advance across China stopped. On July 4th, 1942, the American mobilization caught up with the American volunteer group. Chennault, in preparation for the arrival of the regular United States Army, disbanded the Flying Tigers. The pilots and support crew were invited to join the Army Air Corps. Many didn't. Hill, who'd been credited with 12 1/4 kills, thought about leaving, but decided not to. He'd developed a real affinity for the Chinese people and wanted to stay until the war had been won.
Those people was our friends, traditionally our friends, and they just couldn't do enough for us. They were so grateful. After these battles, the whole village would come down, the whole town would come down to give us all these presents and everything.
The Army Air Force promoted Tex to major and made him a part of the 23rd Fighter Group and installed him as commander of the newly formed 75th Fighter Squadron. Still, he didn't abandon the casual ways of the AVG. Don Lopez, who later became a fighter ace on his own, often told the story of his arrival in China.
He walked into Tex Hill's office as a lieutenant and went to salute. Tex Hill grabbed his hand and said, "Sit down, son." And he noticed on his desk there was no papers. There was an inbox and an outbox. There was peanuts in the inbox and peanut shells in the outbox.
In December 1942, the Army ordered Hill back to the United States. For the next few months, he commanded the Proving Ground Group at Eglin Field in Florida and found himself missing the war.
I'm not a great pilot. I just run of the mill. A lot of guys fly circles around me, but I was dedicated. I was well trained. I was saying, I was dedicated to what I was doing. I loved it. I mean, you know, if it wasn't for people getting hurt, war is real stimulating.
He got back to the war after Chennault told the Army that he needed his best squadron commander back. Chennault requested that Hill be sent back to China and the Army. On Thanksgiving Day, 1943, Hill led a force of 12 B-25s, 10 P-38s, and 8 new P-51s in the first Allied attack against the Japanese stronghold on Formosa. Hill's attackers crossed the Straits of Formosa only 100 feet above the tops of the waves. There were more than 100 bombers and 100 fighters parked on the airfield when the Americans arrived. The attack was devastating. 42 Japanese planes were confirmed destroyed. Another 12 were listed as severely damaged or probably destroyed. The Texas squadron suffered no casualties. By the time he was done in China, Tex Hill had been credited with 18 and a quarter combat kills. He had received 6 decorations from the Chinese government, 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 Air Medals, the Silver Star, and the Legion of Merit, and a host of other awards and decorations. In 1944, he took command of 412th Fighter Group, the first American jet squadron. The war ended before it saw combat. In 1946, Hill, for the second time, resigned his commission to the Air Force. By then a colonel, he resigned as he had before, to take a job for another flying force. This time, Hill moved to the Texas Air National Guard. At 34, becoming the youngest brigadier general in the Air National Guard's history. He retired from the military in 1968.
Thought I did a pretty good job, but I maybe could have done other things that would have been more effective. But I have absolutely no regrets. I mean, joining the American Volunteer Group and marrying my wife Maisie, two of the few things I ever did in my life I wasn't sorry for.